Hello, this is Henrik Bushman. I'm a software developer based in Toronto, and this screencast is about something that I call the Agile production funnel. What I've noticed over the past few years is that we, as developers, have a lot of very good and in many cases very mature design tools and development patterns available to us. And we have the Agile production process in particular, which is the main process or the most popular process, I think rightly so, that developers and development shops use now. Because of the number of tools and processes available, however, it seems to me that many of the tools are sidelined and could probably be taken advantage of more than they are. I think another issue is that, particularly early on in the adoption of an agile process, there's sometimes a bit of a misunderstanding about the agile process, such that there's an inclination to set aside formal tools in favor of a more kind of informal or spontaneous, almost arbitrary set of approaches to software development. Agile is often adopted as a reaction against the more traditional waterfall process. And of course, a high degree of documentation and formality is associated with that waterfall process. So I think there's a natural inclination when making the switch to Agile to essentially throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I guess this concept of a production funnel that I'm about to present is an attempt to bring back the baby from that process, to continue with that metaphor. So here's the basic Agile process as I see it. Project features are identified through a number of processes, in particular in consultation and collaboration with the client, obviously. Those features are funneled into an agile process, the key characteristic of which is that there are lots of feedback mechanisms involved there in order to allow for adaptation to discoveries as the process moves ahead, and then periodically a minimal viable product is released, and the process repeats. There's seems to be more interest as time goes on into increasing that iteration cycle, even to the extent sometimes of releasing features more than once a day. I think more typically it would be every couple of weeks, maybe every month, possibly for a new product, not for 2 or 3 months, but rarely longer than that, in this notion of release early and release often that tends to be associated with the Agile process. What I'm trying to do with this screencast is make a case for putting a bit more focus back into that box at the left, which is relying on the tools, what I call design inputs, and in order to take the maximum advantage of the talent that is available in Agile teams. And I refer to those design inputs as a funnel. I use that metaphor since, in general, although the Agile process is iterative and essentially allows for bouncing around as product and feature discoveries are made, nonetheless, an Agile process, like any other, needs to move forward and proceed to a release stage. And that tends to happen, in my experience, by moving from the general to the specific, roughly speaking. Hence the metaphor of a funnel, which is sort of broad at the top, takes a broad view and a broad reach of the workflow that's about to proceed, but then commitments are made on a kind of stepwise basis as work proceeds, in order to facilitate the practical requirements of a release. So within a release cycle, again, I think although there's a lot of flexibility that should be taken advantage of by members of an Agile development team, nonetheless, again, in my experience, things tend to move quite naturally, broadly speaking, from a broad analysis phase through to a release phase, going through design and development and testing. As you can see by this diagram, I certainly see that there should be iterations. Design is certainly affected by implementation in terms of discoveries that are made through, for example, a refactoring process. Analysis can be found wanting as design proceeds, and it certainly makes sense to cycle back to analysis and make some corrections, do some further research from time to time, and even in the release stage, if there are deficiencies or problems, or in the worst case, if there has to be a rollback, then obviously there has to be a cycle back to the development testing phase. But nonetheless, broadly speaking, there is movement for each release cycle from the top to the bottom. It's not waterfall. So here it is. I've collected, I think it's 16 design tools and process patterns. They look a little scattered. That's deliberate, because I don't think there's benefit in imposing too much formality here, but nonetheless, the drift is from sort of more general tools on the left to more specific and tools that are focused on the concrete side of finishing development cycles, getting some kind of technical closure, testing, authorization to the point where releases can be made. You can see that the lines there are supposed to be indicative of a funnel shape. The idea being that there's kind of a broad reach at the beginning of the cycle to identify priorities and specific features, and as the process moves forward to release, the focus is incrementally and more steadily narrowed to the point where a specific release version, module, a feature can be deployed. So the tools are available as needed. The idea is to allow for the flexibility that Agile promotes. I think that actually helps with productivity. And certainly development teams iterate and experiment according to Agile principles. But my contention is that, broadly speaking, nonetheless, during development cycles, teams tend to move through this process of kind of an open, broad view of the work coming up, focused in a stepwise manner more and more until through a series of decisions that are made and commitments that are made, the final focus is on a very detailed basis to actually get a set of features released. So I'm going to go through those individual tools that are available very briefly. But just quickly to review the Agile manifesto, individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. Note that the authors of the manifesto acknowledge that there is value in the items to the right. They assert that they value the items on the left more. I agree with that. I think there's been lots of experience in the Agile world to support that, although I think quite often, the Agile approach can be misunderstood, in particular if people rely too much on mechanisms and not enough on the social aspect. But broadly speaking, I think this is good. I do want to point out, though, that it's the manifesto does not say that processes and tools, documentation, contracts, and plans should be jettisoned altogether. Just that they should be kind of subservient to the more human aspects, with reliance on personal talent and skills over those kinds of formalities. So those two bold items on the right are my representation of this, my summary of this: people over systems, adaptive over prescriptive. So just going through those 16 items quickly. Business analysis is often associated with the traditional waterfall method, although I think logically it has a place also in the Agile context, simply as a kind of survey of the problem space and a process that extracts key entities and key processes from that survey into the beginnings of a model of the way things are. So it fundamentally identifies agents in the problem space and messaging between pairs of agents, provides the basis for requirements. Now, traditionally, business analysis can be thought of as something fairly narrow or something very broad, including a formal requirement specification. I think of this as being more of a narrow process in the sense of really providing, as I said, a survey and a basis for moving ahead in the process. So requirements analysis then relies on that foundational understanding of the problem space and some of the abstractions, agents, entities that are in there, in particular the communications among those, in order to look at the requirements that exist in that logical model or in that actual business space, depending whether the problem space is something that's new or something that is based on an existing space and needs some kind of evolution. But the requirements analysis then really looks at the processes involved with that business space in order to understand the pool from which the features for the product are likely to be drawn. Impact mapping is an interesting, rapid brainstorming approach that I think has a lot of promise. I haven't personally seen this in action, but from what I can see, it's a valuable approach to look at and consider. You can go to impactmapping.org for details. Essentially, it relies on a collection of senior stakeholders, people that have substantial insight into the business space in order to pull from that group the features that might have the greatest impact on the audience that they have in mind. The impact mapping process contemplates going through a number of fairly straightforward steps in order to accomplish essentially the collection of a number of features that the development team should focus on a priority basis. First by asking what the goal is, then by identifying the key actors that the owners of the system want to impact, then questioning how the actors' behavior should change to identify the impact that's required here, and then finally from that translating those goals and sort of envisioned impacts into features that the devs think they can concretely deliver. There is room here for inserting the notion of disruption into the space, and certainly there's a tendency, I think, in the design phase for project managers and analysts and designers to sort of drift towards the kind of common denominator that exists among the stakeholders and deliver a system that may be functional in the sense of satisfying some of the requirements that were identified early in their phase, without really thinking a lot about the impact side. In other words, there's a tendency to think, I think, about the mechanisms involved and to organize those mechanisms into, pretty pictures and workflows, with the risk of creating something that's essentially boring. This is a place where, by insisting that the developers should constantly focus on the impact that's required, which is to say, focus on the main value that could be delivered by the system for the owners. This is a place where that can and should be done. So from that process, there's another somewhat formal process that has been identified by someone named Chris Matz. There's a link there. And that is to identify and prioritize the high-value business features from the previous steps. Again, really hunt for those values, inject the features, and look for examples, particular use cases that are going to have the highest impact on the identified audience. That then will feed into the behavior-driven development process, which I'll cover later. Now, somewhere in here, there should be a creative development process. This, as I say in this slide, this is way outside of my wheelhouse. I don't get this process. I have the highest respect for it. I also think that for a meaningful system is also a requirement. I think the idea is to find creative people that understand how to manage that process and give them a crack fairly early on at doing their magic, doing some lateral thinking, doing some brainstorming, trying out some ideas, making some presentations, almost like, I don't know, advertising companies, marketing companies do, and see how that creative side can be incorporated into the feature set that's been identified through the other processes that I've identified. Obviously, once the features are developed, then it's time to think seriously as most shops probably now do, or many do, about the Agile management process. Quick review, it's an iterative development process, often involving short sprints, typically 2 to 3 weeks, I guess. Work is organized into features and functional requirements that are called user stories, and those are broken down into particular tasks for the developers primarily. Obviously, the developers should be involved in all this organization work, and it relies on appropriate organization, including a product owner, Scrum Master, and devs. I think another point to make here is that feedback I've seen is that Agile is a difficult process to implement. It takes not months but years. It requires both technological support in terms of project management tools and such, and critically, it involves kind of a building of social relations, mutual understanding of skill sets, and trust and great communication among the members of the team. So having stable teams of highly skilled developers that can often swap roles, support each other, can pair within that group in order to accomplish tasks. Pairing seems to be a very effective mechanism, thanks to the concepts of extreme programming to get the best out of people and avoid mistakes or mediocrity. So all those things are important in terms of the management of the Agile teams. So here we have behavior-driven development. It relies on stories, which are derived from the feature set that's been identified previously. Again, this is not waterfall. You can go back and forth and cycle around as necessary. As discoveries are made, go back and look at other decisions that have been made to see whether they should be visited. Behavior-driven development is useful because it allows for a common thread running all the way from the domain experts or customers through to designers, user experience people, architects, right to the developers that set the code, not just in concept, but the scenarios there, which can and should be stated with the formal language, given, when, then, but, and, which is the basis for assertions, can also form the basis for automated testing. And there are a number of tools, BHAT for PHP, for example, that the Cucumber is another one for other circumstances that can take those English-like statements, analyze them, and associate them with specific test scenario assertions. So it's a very good way, using this so-called Gherkin language, to really provide consistency consistency in the language, and therefore in the goals, and hopefully in the productivity among all the people that are involved in a project. Design Studio is a approach that I have seen. It seems to generate a lot of excitement. I gather it's taken from industrial process design applied to software. It's an intense brainstorming, collective brainstorming method, which again involves assembling pretty high-level people that understand the business space very well. And the process there is to have enough people involved, 6 to 10 people, such that they can be broken up into smaller teams, 3 or 4 people, each of which will all of whom together will share in an understanding of the business context that they're working in to begin with. That's the illumination phase. Then assemble a high volume of ideas, both collectively and within smaller teams, and then present those ideas. Each team would identify a leader, present those ideas to the rest of the group, actually try to sell those ideas, negotiate issues as they're uncovered, and then possibly remix the teams, recombine the teams, certainly recombine and remix the ideas that are generated in an iterative process, all of which helps to extract and transform those ideas into user interface workflows, concepts, and understandings, which can then translate into very specific feature sets and instructions for the developers. Domain-driven design is my favorite, probably, design approach. I highly recommend going and looking up the Domain-Driven Design book by Eric Evans. It was released in about 2003, 2004. It is an approach which is appropriate for large, complex systems. And what Eric has done is found that in that context, it is more critical than ever to have a clean design of a system, and because of the volume and complexity of the ideas involved, the best way to go about it realistically in a way that makes progress and results in a clean system which is maintainable and scalable is to focus on the core domain design. That means beginning with a layered architecture pattern, the interface level, the application level, the domain level, the infrastructure level, in order to isolate the domain level, which is essentially the business rules, and then within that to really identify the core domain design and essentially work outward from there. It's very difficult. It's an iterative process. It involves experimentation as well. It very much involves developing a common language that is understood not only by the developers but also by the domain experts that are involved. And in a large system, it involves defining clear context boundaries in order to break a large problem space into smaller problem spaces, and then working on developing a map of terminology and meanings that allow for effective messaging, essentially, among those contexts. A key point that he makes is that it's critical to bind the design and the implementation, and therefore it is critical to involve both the domain experts and the developers in the process on an ongoing basis, to the point even of making sure that the specific language of the design is reflected in the code itself and in the organization and naming of the modules and so forth. Very interesting stuff. Highly recommended. The database modeling is an important part of the architectural process. I've heard Martin Fowler recently describe architecture as, or define architecture as involving artifacts of a system that are critically important and very difficult to change. It's an interesting definition of architecture. I think most people think in terms of separation of concerns and major components, things like that, but it's sort of a more grounded definition. Database, by definition, tends to be hard to change. There are migration tools available now that eases the pressure on that to some extent. nonetheless, it's a good way of implementing the concepts of a design, and because it's a very technical exercise that requires resolution of contradictions and meanings and relationships at the finest grain level, it tends to be a good source for discovering weaknesses or deficiencies in a design up to that point. So it's certainly something that has to be done clearly for any system, and is also worthwhile for the overall model development. Intrinsic design is a term that I use. I don't see it used very much. It involves taking existing designs and then looking at them essentially logically to obtain a state of closure for the designs that exist on a logical basis. In other words, making sure that internally and intrinsically things like the database design, workflow designs, and so forth are comprehensive, complete, and that any obvious extrapolations that may have been missed through brainstorming sessions are at least reviewed and looked at without without diverging from the overall plan, essentially cleaning things up. So that's a good process to go through. Test-driven development, as we're getting closer to and more involved with the implementation and release part of the cycle, is a notion. Test-driven development is a notion that was developed by Kent Beck early on, I think probably early 80s. The idea is to go through this, what's now called a red-green refactor cycle, close to the code. It means essentially writing a failing test for a function or a method before you write it, actually running what are referred to these unit tests to demonstrate that the test has failed, and then write code that is sufficient to make the test succeed, and finally refactor that code to improve, clarify, and eliminate redundancy. This is a hard one for people to get their heads around. Unit tests are sometimes seen as an afterthought, an extra cost, really only valuable for regressions, and I think a lot of developers feel that they're not needed. Kent takes a different approach to it, really relying on writing a failing test before the code is actually written in order to clarify the intention of what he's trying to do, as a way to provide better focus and, in fact, more efficient implementation of the code itself. So I've heard him talk about this a number of times. He feels that for him at least, and for so many people that implement this approach, it's a great way of breaking a problem into smaller bite-sized pieces, beginning to identify and clarify intentions, and gradually building up a system that makes sense. So, well worthwhile. Functional test automation, end-to-end test automation, is something that is particularly helpful to catch regressions. So we're talking about end-to-end test automation here. For example, using Protractor to run end-to-end tests against Angular applications. Selenium Server, developed a while ago by ThoughtWorks, is probably the most common server that is used to control browsers. It's free. I'm not sure if it's open source. It probably is, and it's certainly widely used now, so that there are various drivers available for various languages, essentially, Selenium takes JSON packages of instructions, so it's not that hard to write drivers in front of it. Exactly the tool you use will depend on the environment. Again, the key use is finding regressions. I think it's possible to develop tests in advance. I don't think it's as useful in this context as developing tests prior to implementation in the test-driven development approach that I mentioned earlier. By the way, there is some confusion, I think, between behavior-driven development and test-driven development. Some people think that they're mutually exclusive. I don't think they are at all. I think test-driven development is very close to the code, as Kent Beck has defined, whereas behavior-driven development is a more recent development that is more useful on a kind of a broad level. Now, in terms of process patterns, continuous improvement, I think, is worth looking at. Having retrospectives, for example, on sprints. The idea is to focus on improving processes. In my view, in particular, when a bug arises, when some kind of problem arises, when some kind of misunderstanding arises, it's a good idea to kind of collect those some of those things, before they become overwhelming. Pull the group together, and then be very specific about each one in terms of examining the conditions that existed when those problems arose, and seeing about finding ways of avoiding those, whether it's kind of looking at decoupling issues, API issues, even annotation, communication issues, whatever it is. The idea is to improve processes and understandings within the Agile group gradually on an incremental basis. Continuous integration, given that there's a Git repository typically for applications, and some kind of continuous integration tool such as Jenkins or ThoughtWorks GoCD. It's been found that it's worthwhile to integrate code frequently, certainly on a daily basis, if not more, and to automate the process of building and testing those things in order to provide a very tight feedback loop to the developers. Continuous delivery is finding more and more favor. It's really an extension of the continuous integration process, and it involves the delivery team thinking in terms of frequent releases, at least to the staging server level, and possibly even continuous deployment, with some authorization process intervening, but mostly automated directly to the live sites. So it involves automated version control, build and unit tests, automated acceptance tests, user acceptance tests, and release. ThoughtWorks Go continuous delivery system looks like a good candidate for that. In many cases, once a continuous delivery system is implemented and has been proved to be reliable, it is possible to release software as frequently as multiple times in a single day if needed. So there you have it. This is not necessarily a comprehensive set of design tools and process patterns, but I've tried to collect most of the well-known ideas. The notion I'm trying to present, again, is to make them all available, use them as appropriate, become more familiar with them, And depending on the individuals that are involved in a particular Agile team, try to rely on them as much as possible, because in each individual case, they are approaches and processes that have been shown to actually improve productivity, and certainly improve the quality of the resulting output, such that the ongoing developments don't lead to a brittle system, which over time becomes harder and harder to maintain and extend, but rather becomes a system that in a way becomes easier and easier over time to extend with features, since the code base is clean, the designs are clean, and essentially the services that are available to the system are quite clean, and therefore can be extended or recombined in interesting ways as time goes on. So there you have it. Feel free to contact me at the email that's shown there, and have a good day.